Welcome to our ICQ Comets and Cousins YouTube channel. I'm Dan Green, and this is the second installment of a video with Dr. Zdenek Sekanina regarding his life in researching comets. We thank Professor Jeremy Tatum for answering on behalf of Dr. Sekanina for some of the questions. As with the first Sekanina interview video, I narrate the questions that were posted by our team via email to Dr. Sekanina, and team member Carl Hergenrother answers questions on behalf of Dr. Sekanina that Professor Tatum does not. In the description text for this video, you can find a link to the first Sekanina interview video. Our third and final video of the Sekanina interview sequence will contain a link to the complete written transcript of his entire interview, which has been edited slightly for video production. Was the giant Tunguska explosion over Siberia in 1908 cometary or asteroidal in your thinking?
With today's foggy distinction between comets and asteroids getting foggier every year, one confronts a situation very different from that I did 40 years ago. I can therefore reformulate my answer and say that, in my opinion, the object was asteroidal. But if there are cometary objects that can withstand dynamic pressures of up to 10 to the 7th Pascal, Tunguska could have been such a comet. But I think it is silly to refer to such an object as a comet.
What are your thoughts on the odd interstellar object known as 1I Oumuamua? I have often wondered what Brian Marsden would have made of that interstellar object. Suichi Nakano is mystified that there seem to be non-gravitational forces at work in the motion of Oumuamua, while it showed only asteroidal appearance.
I do not see any reason to change the opinion I expressed in my papers on this object. If the non-gravitational force varied as an inverse square of heliocentric distance, it must have been radiation pressure. In one of my papers, I started by assuming that the force was sublimation driven, and ended up by concluding that this would only be possible if the bulk density was exceedingly low, which was exactly what the model postulating radiation pressure assumed. Faint and dust-poor Oort cloud comets do not survive perihelion, but we do not know what their post-perihelion debris look like. With one eye, it was the other way around. We did not know how the object looked before its disintegration. Are there some who think that this weird pole or disk was traveling through the galaxy for millions of years? Well, I'm not one of them. I think that the object looked more like 2I, got decimated on its way to perihelion, and the largest piece of what was left was picked up after perihelion.
What do you think of the interstellar comet 2I Borisov?
I do not know much about 2I, but I wonder to what extent it is alike to the Oort cloud comets.
How often do you think that we'll find interstellar comets in the future?
I dealt with the topic of the spatial density of interstellar comets so long ago that at the time I could only place an upper limit on this quantity. I do not believe that our knowledge of one so-so interstellar comet and the remains of another is enough to derive a meaningful estimate of the long-term rate of their encounters. My wild guess is that in the future, we may meet one or up to a few per century.
Brian Marsden and I frequently discussed how odd it was that we had no definitive interstellar objects to have ever knowingly passed through the solar system, with any hyperbolic orbits of older comets having been too uncertain to know if they were certainly hyperbolic when entering the inner solar system, due to lack of really good astrometry. Please tell us a little about your interactions with Smithsonian astronomer Brian Marsden over the years. And what other cometary scientists did you find most interesting in working with during your scientific career?
My interaction with Brian, scientific or otherwise, was a sheer delight. We laughed even as we were removing astrometric observations with unacceptably large positional residuals from orbital runs. When I talked to Fred Whipple at the Liege Comet Conference in July 1965, which Brian did not attend, he mentioned that he decided to settle the problem of the non-gravitational effects in cometary motion once and for all. He indicated that he was about to bring to the observatory, as Fred was SAO director at the time, a young bright guy named Brian Marsden. I believe that this had been the first time I heard Brian's name. To the best of my recollection, Brian and I began to exchange letters probably in 1966. The big break came in August 1967 when Brian attended the IAU General Assembly in Prague. During his 2-week stay in Prague, we invited Brian to our apartment and let him read a long paragraph from the Czech book Adventures of the Good Soldier Schweik in the World War, which he successfully managed with his impeccable British accent. My wife and I soon burst out laughing, but Brian continued to the end of the paragraph. When the IAU meeting was over, we parted with the understanding that we'll keep in touch, and sure enough, the rate of our letter exchange was increasing exponentially. After I arrived at the Smithsonian Observatory in March 1969, I found Brian literally buried in a hill of new results from his orbital computations. I tried to help him as much as I could, but he needed a dozen helpers, not one. We both tried to make sense of the numbers that were coming out of the computer, but it was not easy. The tricky problems of the non-gravitational effects were a new experience to both of us, yet I rate those days among the happiest in my scientific career. Then there were meetings I had with Fred Whipple in his office, especially after he retired as director and had much more time for science. Those meetings were unforgettable and I learned a lot from Fred. In the late 1970s, we both got interested in cometary rotation. His primary interest was the spin rate. Mine was the axis orientation, but our interests overlapped. One result of our meetings was a computer code that I began to write to model the variety of dust coma features that rotation was strongly affecting. I used the code in the subsequent years to considerable advantage. With the exception of Steve Larson, no one seemed to give a damn about rotating comets at the time, and one NASA official that unfortunately was involved with funding my research even asked, why, for God's sake, should comets even rotate? That shows how far ahead of the field Fred and I were. Steve Larson was another scientist that I enjoyed to work with. By the early 1980s, I was pretty sure that rotation had a dramatic effect on the appearance and morphology of dust and cometary heads, and since this was the time when Halley's Comet began to make comet scientists behave in a hyper manner, we decided with Steve to work on this famous object. We were incredibly lucky to locate the Halley plates that in 1910 were exposed by Dr. Ritchie with the 1.5 meter reflector at Mount Wilson, by Dr. Curtis with the 0.9 meter Crossley reflector at Lick. The images showed all sorts of jets, spirals, fans, halos, etc., especially after application of image-enhancing techniques. So this was a very successful project even before we started to model the rotation-driven features. I wrote papers with a number of other people: John Farrell, Martha Hanner, Don Yeomans, Don Brownlee, Paul Chodas, or Rainier Crott, to name a few, and I never experienced any conflicts with my collaborators.
Here's a question from Mike Meyer for Dr. Sekanina. I would like to know what your opinion is on the Meyer group of sun-grazing comets, if you have done some work on it. It is by far the most populated group after the Kreutz group. I suspect that the group is very old and scattered, and due to the larger perihelion distance compared to the Kreutz group, the members have more survival chances.
Like everybody else, I've been waiting for the parent comet too, though I've done no work whatsoever with the Meyer group.
Much has been learned about comets in your lifetime. What things do you think might be learned about comets in the next century that we don't know about now?
I think one can expect the launch of long-term missions to short-period comets, those staying for more than one revolution about the Sun, and rendezvous missions to long-period and Oort cloud comets on their way to perihelion. Among the results I expect are close-up views from onboard cameras, say of a major outburst, a major fragmentation event, and possibly disintegration of a comet's nucleus. I hope that the origin and history of the Kreutz sungrazers will be firmly established following observations of a number of bright members of this system. Knowledge of the nucleus's interior, its morphology, mineralogy, and chemistry will be substantially augmented. Information will be acquired about a large number of comets on highly elongated orbits with perihelia beyond Neptune from observations made by orbiting telescopes. One or a few additional interstellar comets will be discovered and extensively investigated. And finally, great progress will be reached in the study of comets orbiting nearby stars, with orbits being derived for some of them.